The harbor water smells wrong. Not like tar, fish, and wet rope, but like cold ash. Your hand is still on the rail, damp with sea spray, when you notice the silence. No dockhands calling, no creak of cargo being lowered, no temple smoke rising in its thin, familiar line. Just gulls turning above blackened beams and a shoreline that looks as if someone dragged fire across it in the night. You came here expecting routine, a stop, an exchange, maybe a little shouting over weights and storage space, then back out again. Instead, the air itself feels emptied. A ship lists near the quay. Something broken bumps against its side with a hollow knock, again and again. From a distance, it almost looks peaceful. Then you get closer, and peace is the last word you would use. That feeling, that moment when a working world suddenly stops making sense, is the doorway into the late Bronze Age collapse of 1177 BC. Because this was not just one ruined port, or one king losing one war. This was something bigger, stranger, and far more unsettling. Across the eastern Mediterranean, powers that had stood for generations began to fail. Trade cities like Ugarit were destroyed. Mycenaean Greece broke apart. The Hittite Empire disappeared. Egypt survived, but even Egypt came out of it diminished, drained, and changed. And the most disturbing part is this. The world that collapsed was not primitive. It was connected, rich, organized, dependent on ships, ports, and long chains of exchange that tied one coast to another. Copper moved from Cyprus. Tin came from far away, from places as distant as Afghanistan. Together, they made bronze, the metal behind tools, weapons, labor, harvests, and power itself. Pull one link out of that chain, and the shock did not stay local. It traveled. That is why this story still feels modern when you get close enough to touch it. A tightly coupled trade network can look strong right up until the moment it starts passing damage from one end to the other. And somewhere beneath the surface of this ancient disaster lies the first hard clue. A ship that sank long before the collapse, carrying the cargo of a whole world in its belly. If this kind of deep history is your thing, like the video and stay with me, because the first real witness to this catastrophe is waiting on the seafloor. That witness lies far from the burned harbor, under dark water, sealed in silence for centuries. Long before the collapse reached its breaking point, a ship went down off the coast near Uluburun around 1300 BC. It did not sink during the final disaster. That matters. What it gives us is something cleaner, and in a way more unsettling, a snapshot of the world while the system was still working. Just cargo, no story told after the fact, no king's excuse, no monument trying to look eternal. Wood, weight, and the cold logic of trade. And what a cargo it was. The Uluburun shipwreck carried goods from at least 7 cultures. Think about what that means in human terms. Somewhere, men cut timber. Somewhere else, metal was smelted and shaped. Somewhere, scribes tracked obligations. Somewhere, dock workers loaded jars, ingots, and crafted goods into a hull that smelled of pitch, wet rope, salt, and raw wood. Then that ship moved across open water as one small part of a much larger machine. This is where the old world starts to feel less ancient and more familiar. You are not looking at isolated kingdoms trading the occasional luxury gift. You are looking at a tightly coupled trade network. Different regions were not merely in contact, they were functionally dependent on one another. A delay in one place could become anxiety in another. A failed shipment was not just inconvenience. It could mean idle workshops, weaker tools, unpaid labor, or empty storehouses waiting on something that never arrived. And that ship makes the scale visible in a way ruins on land sometimes do not. A wreck on the seafloor cannot flatter a ruler. It cannot pretend the system was simpler than it was. It just sits there, holding the evidence in place. At Uluburun, the world of palaces, ports, and merchants is packed together so tightly that you can almost feel the pressure of it, the strain of a whole age balancing on movement. Which brings us to the material that held that age together. Bronze sounds solid when you say the word. Strong, reliable, permanent. But the metal at the heart of this world was born from dependence. It needed copper from one place, tin from another, and those places were often very far apart. In other words, the strength of that civilization began with a weakness hidden inside its own foundations. And once you see that, the next layer of the late Bronze Age collapse of 1177 BC becomes much darker. That hidden weakness starts with a simple fact. Bronze was never a local miracle. To make it, you needed copper and tin together. Copper could come from Cyprus. Tin might come from as far away as Afghanistan. Those are not neighboring stops on a short coastal run. They belong to a chain stretched across mountains, roads, warehouses, ports, and open sea. So when people in this world held a bronze blade or drove a bronze tool into wood, they were touching a map of dependencies they could not see. That matters more than it first seems. A kingdom could have ships, scribes, storehouses, and soldiers. It could have fields under the sun and walls above the plain. But if it did not have both metals arriving in the right amounts at the right time, then all that visible strength rested on absence, on what had not yet gone wrong. Bronze was power, yes, but it was also a promise that distant places would keep functioning. Mines had to produce. Caravans had to move. Harbors had to stay open. Cargo had to survive storms, theft, delay, and simple bad luck. And in a trade network this tight, trouble does not stay where it begins. You can feel the logic of it even now. A shortage in one far-off region does not politely remain there. It reaches outward. First a delay, then substitutions, then higher pressure on the route still working, then fear, then hoarding, then choices made in haste. We know that feeling in our own age. One blocked route, one missing component, one dry season in the wrong place, and suddenly a factory far away slows down, shelves thin out, prices rise, tempers shorten. Strip away the engines and containers, and the old system was vulnerable in much the same way. This is one reason the late Bronze Age collapse of 1177 BC refuses simple explanations. The system was strong because it was connected. It was fragile for exactly the same reason. The better it worked, the more each palace, workshop, and port came to depend on things beyond its control. And then there is the harder thought. Even a fragile trade web can survive ordinary shocks. A late convoy is not enough. A lost cargo is not enough. A season of poor harvests by itself is not always enough. For this world to begin coming apart on such a scale, something else had to be pressing on it at the same time. Not just at the edges of trade, but in the soil, in the water, in the growth rings of trees, where no ruler could command the sky. That is where the ground itself begins to testify. Not with a speech, not with a royal inscription, but with quiet layers of mud at the bottom of old lakes. Year after year, season after season, the landscape left traces there. Pollen drifted down, dust settled, water levels rose and fell, then marked those changes in silence. Tree rings did something similar on land. Each narrow ring held a hard year. Each broader ring held relief. And when those records are lined up around the Eastern Mediterranean, they begin to point in the same direction, toward stress that lasted and did not quickly pass. This matters because the collapse did not happen in empty political space. It happened in a living environment that may already have been tightening around these kingdoms. Pollen cores suggest the balance of plants was changing. Lake levels point to less water. Tree rings hint at repeated strain. None of that looks dramatic when taken alone. A dry year is survivable. Two can be endured. But if you are dealing with a world already dependent on long routes, timed deliveries, and palace storage, prolonged drought becomes something else. It starts pressing on every weak seam at once. Picture the feel of it at ground level. Soil that powders too easily under the foot. A field whose color turns dull too early in the season. Reed beds shrinking back from the edge of a lake. Wells tasting lower, thinner, warmer. Oxen still pulling, farmers still working, scribes still making marks in storerooms, but all of it under a sky that is giving less than before. You do not need one grand catastrophe to begin a breakdown. You only need enough bad years in the wrong order, hitting a world that no longer has much slack left in it. And the old image of sudden destruction can be misleading. The end may have felt sudden in burned cities, but the conditions beneath it may have been building quietly for years. A ship arrives late. A harvest disappoints. Grain stores are opened sooner than expected. Demands do not shrink just because rainfall does. Armies still need feeding, ports still need guarding, metal still needs moving. In a system like that, drought is not just weather. It becomes political pressure, social pressure, military pressure. So by the time the fires appear in the record, the crisis may already be older than the flames. And if the sky was failing them first, the next question is what those strained states looked like on the inside, before the walls finally gave way. Inside those strained states, power was concentrated in a way that looked impressive, right up until the moment it became dangerous. The old kingdoms were not loose collections of villages casually trading with one another. They were organized around centers, palaces, storehouses, officials, ports, and the people who counted, moved, and guarded what came in. Grain, metal, labor, and goods did not just flow through the landscape at random. They were gathered, tracked, directed. That kind of structure can make a society look strong from the outside. It can build walls, arm soldiers, and feed large populations. But it also means strain collects in the middle. If the rains weaken, the pressure goes inward. If shipments slow, the pressure goes inward. If copper arrives but tin does not, or grain is needed in more than one place at once, the pressure goes inward again. The center has to solve everything. It has to ration, store, redirect, defend, negotiate, and somehow keep the confidence of the people below it. And confidence matters more than it sounds. A palace is not only stone and administration, it is a promise that the system still works. Now imagine that promise beginning to fray. You are a farmer bringing in less than expected. You are a porter waiting for a shipment that should already be there. You are a metal worker touching tools that cannot be replaced as easily as before. The dust on the road is finer this year. The baskets feel lighter. The officials still demand. The walls still stand. The records are still being kept. But the margin for error is shrinking. In a world like that, shortage is never just shortage. It becomes resentment, fear, and quiet improvisation. People start keeping back what they can. Authorities squeeze harder. Rumor travels faster than carts. And this is where the late Bronze Age collapse of 1177 BC stops looking like a distant puzzle and starts feeling like a living system under stress. A buildup. the kind that makes a state appear intact even while it is becoming brittle inside. That brittleness helps explain something important about what comes next. When destruction finally appears across the region, when the Hittite Empire falls, when Mycenaean Greece breaks apart, when trade cities like Ugarit are ruined, it does not arrive in a healthy world struck by bad luck. It lands in one already thinned out by dependency, drought, and rising pressure at the center. And once you see that, another possibility comes into view. Maybe the famous raiders at the edges were not the beginning of the story at all. That possibility changes the whole shape of the disaster. For a long time, it is tempting to imagine the end arriving from outside, from ships on the horizon, from armed strangers, from the kind of threat a kingdom can point to and name. And in this story, there is a famous name waiting for that role: the Sea Peoples. The phrase has a heavy sound to it. It feels like an answer. It feels like the moment the mystery clicks into place. But answers that feel good too early are often the wrong ones. If a world is already strained by weaker harvests, tighter storage, and fragile supply lines, then mobile raiders need not create the crisis from nothing. They only need to enter it. They can feed on it, push it harder, and make every decision more desperate. In that sense, violence at the edges may be less like the first crack in the wall and more like water finding the cracks that were already there. Picture the coastline in such a moment. Harbors are still functioning, but more nervously. Watches are longer. Cargo is checked with sharper eyes. A ship that should bring relief might instead bring rumor. Families move inland. Officials send messages faster than goods. The smell of salt and pitch is still there, but now it mixes with something else: hesitation. In that trade network, fear itself becomes a kind of damage. Merchants delay, routes shift, protection costs more, trust thins out. And once trust starts thinning, the system loses one of the things it cannot easily replace. So the collapse resists the tidy story of barbarians smashing a healthy civilization. A healthy system can absorb raids. It can punish, rebuild, redirect. But a weakened one has to make uglier choices. Guard the convoy or the granary. Feed the garrison or the laborers. Send metal where it is promised or hold it back because next month looks worse. Pressure multiplies because every solution harms something else. So when the Hittite Empire falls, when Mycenaean Greece breaks apart, when Ugarit is destroyed, the damage does not look like one clean wave rolling across a map. It looks more like different parts of the same world failing under different combinations of stress. Some burn, some empty out, some survive in reduced form, like Egypt. None come through untouched. Which brings us to the next layer. Because if raiding and migration were accelerants rather than the first spark, then we have to look for the forces that made so many states vulnerable at once. And one of those forces may have come from beneath their feet. What those vulnerable states faced next was not one neat ending, but a pattern. You can see it in the map of what failed. The Hittite Empire is gone. Mycenaean Greece fragments. Cities like Ugarit are destroyed. Egypt survives, but not in the old, confident sense of the word. It comes through diminished, its strength narrowed, its reach reduced. That uneven outcome matters. If this had been one simple disaster, you would expect one simple result. But that is not what the record gives us. It gives us a region where connected powers are hit differently, and yet all are changed by the same era of strain. That is one of the reasons this collapse still unsettles historians. It does not behave like a single battlefield story. It behaves like a system failure. One kingdom falls completely, another fragments, another endures, but thinner, poorer, more brittle than before. The old web does not snap in one clean line. It frays, knots, tears, and then begins dragging its own damage from one shore to another. Think of what that means in lived terms. Somewhere, a port that once expected cargo now waits in silence. Somewhere, workshops slow because the materials do not arrive. Somewhere else, officials still try to hold order together with records, promises, and stored grain. But the reach of the center is shrinking. A harbor can still smell of salt and wet timber and still be part of a world that is coming apart. That is the dreadful thing about a collapse like this. For a while, ordinary routines keep moving inside a structure that is already failing. And once the great powers begin to weaken, the damage no longer stays inside their borders. The fall of one center becomes pressure on another. Trade routes grow less reliable. Fewer safe routes mean more pressure on the ones left. More pressure means more delay, more fear, more improvisation. In a trade network, collapse travels. It moves through dependence. This is where the story stops being about isolated ruins and becomes something colder. You are looking at an age in which strength itself had become contagious weakness. The same connections that once carried copper, tin, grain, and prestige now carried disruption. And that is the threshold of the deeper explanation. Because once you stop searching for one dramatic culprit, the whole picture begins to rearrange itself around a harsher idea. One Eric Klein would later describe with a phrase that fits disturbingly well. That phrase is the perfect storm of collapse. Eric Klein uses it because nothing simpler really fits. Not one invasion, not one failed harvest, not one broken kingdom. What happened at the end of this age looks more like several pressures arriving close enough together and hard enough together that they began reinforcing one another. The drought matters. The fragile bronze supply chain matters. The destruction of major powers matters. The movement of raiders and displaced groups matters. Each on its own is serious. Together, they become something colder than a normal crisis. They become a system, teaching every part of itself how to fail. And once you start seeing it that way, the old evidence changes shape. The Uluburun shipwreck is no longer just proof of wealth and reach. It becomes proof of exposure. A cargo drawn from at least 7 cultures means a world tied together by constant motion. Copper from Cyprus and tin from distant regions like Afghanistan were not optional luxuries. They were part of the structure. Then add the environmental strain suggested by pollen cores, lake levels, and tree rings around 1200 BC. A dry landscape gives less food. Less food means more pressure on storage, transport, and authority. Add destruction in the Hittite Empire, in Mycenaean Greece, in cities like Ugarit. Add a surviving Egypt that still comes out reduced. At that point, you are looking not at one blow landing on one target, but at pressure bouncing through connected states until the whole frame begins to shake. There is something unnerving about that because it feels so modern. You do not need every harbor to burn at once for a network to become unreliable. You only need enough missed connections, enough shortages, enough fear, enough rerouting. Enough seasons when the expected shipment does not arrive, and the backup plan is already committed somewhere else. In a world built on timing, trust, and distance, disruption multiplies. That is why this collapse is so hard to explain with a single dramatic image. The image that fits best is strain traveling, not a duel. And yet, even that is not the whole picture. Because a model can tell you how a system breaks, but not what it feels like from inside the rooms where officials are counting grain, from inside the workshops waiting on metal, from inside the ports where familiar routes begin to fail. To understand why the end became so total, we have to step closer again into the everyday machinery of palace life, where stress turned into something people could touch. To step inside that machinery, you have to imagine a world that ran on storage, physical storage, grain in bins, metal in guarded rooms, goods stacked in jars, baskets, and bundles, lists somewhere nearby, hands measuring, lifting, sealing, checking. In good years, that kind of order must have felt reassuring. The center gathered what the land produced, held it, counted it, and sent it back out again. Food, tools, raw material, protection. All of it passed through authority. That is how these kingdoms turned harvest and trade into organized strength. But a system built around central control has a quiet weakness. When stress comes, everyone turns to the same place. If the fields yield less, the storerooms matter more. If routes become uncertain, the storerooms matter more. If bronze depends on copper from Cyprus and tin from much farther away, then every delayed delivery increases the value of what is already under lock. You can almost feel the air in those spaces. Dry grain dust, cool clay, the scrape of containers across stone floors. The tension of people pretending routine is still routine. Because once shortage enters a central system, it does not stay economic for long. It becomes social, political, emotional. Think about what that means at the level of ordinary life. A worker who expects rations cannot eat a promise. A craftsperson cannot shape missing metal. A guard watching a gate cannot calm a crowd with a ledger. And the people at the top, the ones trying to keep the whole thing balanced, are forced into decisions that poison trust whichever way they turn. Release reserves too early and later becomes dangerous. Hold them back too long and fear spreads now. Protect one route and another goes exposed. Feed one group and another starts asking what their loyalty is worth. This is the human texture of the late Bronze Age collapse of 1177 BC that a map alone cannot show you. Before cities burn, before kingdoms disappear from the record, there is this slower damage, the narrowing of options inside systems that were designed to look stable. From the outside, walls still stand. Ships still come and go, orders are still given, but inside, the margin is shrinking. And when a society reaches that point, even a shock that should be survivable can become disastrous. Because the next pressure does not have to be political. It does not even have to come from the sea. In a world already thinned by drought, dependency, and fear, even the ground moving under a city could become one more force that turns strain into collapse. And that is where the story turns from structures to people. A collapse like this is easy to describe at a distance. Kingdoms shrink, trade fails, cities burn. But that is not how anyone inside it would have felt the change at first. They would have felt it in smaller ways. A ration a little thinner, a shipment late enough to cause argument, a workshop quieter than it should be, a road that suddenly feels less safe at dusk. The smell of grain dust still hangs in the air, the harbor still tastes of salt, the ledgers are still being marked. But something underneath ordinary life has begun to tighten. That is the human pressure inside the late Bronze Age collapse of 1177 BC. If bronze depends on copper from Cyprus and tin from beyond the Eastern Mediterranean, then delays are no longer technical problems. They become lived ones. A missing load of metal means tools not finished, weapons not replaced, promised work not completed on time. If drought is already pressing on fields and storage, then every failed delivery matters more than it did before. People do not need to understand the whole map to feel the consequences of a broken route. They only need to notice that what used to arrive doesn't. And once enough people notice that, the mood of a society changes. You can imagine a port official trying to stay calm while counting less than expected. A laborer waiting near a storeroom door, hoping the measured portion will be enough. A trader watching the horizon for sales that should have appeared by now. None of them needs to speak for us to understand the consequence. Anxiety becomes part of the system. It travels through glances, delays, rumors, and harder decisions at every level. In a world already bound together so tightly, uncertainty is not just an emotion. It is another form of damage. This is why the end of the Old Order was not only dramatic at the top, it was corrosive from below. Trust weakens, patience thins, local problems stop staying local. What once felt dependable begins to feel negotiated, temporary, exposed. And when enough people begin to live that way at the same time, the center loses something more valuable than stored goods. It loses the belief that it can still protect the world it claims to rule. And once that belief goes, the fall of a palace or a city is no longer the start of the disaster. It is the moment everyone else finally sees the disaster has been underway for quite some time. That is the moment the map darkens. Up to now, we have been watching pressure build inside storerooms, along sea routes, across dry fields, through delayed cargo and thinning trust. But eventually, pressure stops being quiet. It leaves marks large enough to see at a distance. The Hittite Empire is destroyed. Mycenaean Greece breaks apart. Ugarit, one of those vital trade cities, is ruined. Egypt survives, but survives in the diminished sense. Still standing, yes, yet no longer carrying the same weight in that world. Those outcomes are not identical, and that difference matters. One power disappears from its old position entirely. Another loses the palace order that once held it together. Another city that had lived by exchange is cut out of the system altogether. Egypt remains, but with less room to project power, less ability to hold the wider network in place. This is not a single stamp pressed onto every kingdom. It is regional damage moving through different structures in different ways. The same era breaks each one according to its weaknesses. And that is what makes the collapse feel so unnerving. If one enemy had simply conquered everyone, the pattern would be easier to understand. If one plague, one king, one battle, one failed season explained everything, the story would be cleaner. But clean is not what we have. We have a tightly coupled trade network under strain, environmental pressure gathering over time, political systems forced to absorb too much, and then destruction appearing across multiple centers that were bound together by dependence long before they fell apart. So when you picture this moment, do not imagine one curtain dropping all at once. Imagine scattered shocks arriving in a world now trembling. A harbor closed here, a route broken there, a storehouse opened too early, a court waiting on news that does not come, a city learning that the neighbor it relied on can no longer help, because that neighbor is fighting to keep its own gates watched and its own reserves measured. In a world like that, every fall creates more falling. Every broken node sends strain outward. This is why the old age does not merely decline, it unravels. And yet, there is still another layer to confront, because some collapses spread through hunger and fear, some through distance and politics, and some through the physical instability of the land itself. If drought weakened the body of this world, and fractured trade weakened its limbs, then the next question is whether the ground beneath it also began to move at exactly the wrong time. That question matters. But before we give the ground too much blame, we have to stay disciplined about what the strongest evidence actually shows. The clearest backbone of this story is still the one we already have in our hands. A world proven by the Uluburun shipwreck to be deeply connected. A metal economy dependent on copper from Cyprus and tin from distant places like Afghanistan. Environmental signals, pollen cores, lake levels, tree rings, pointing toward prolonged drought around 1200 BC. Then, the visible outcomes. The Hittite Empire destroyed, Mycenaean Greece broken apart, trade cities like Ugarit ruined, Egypt surviving but sharply reduced. When you lay those pieces side by side, the shape that emerges is a regional crisis moving through an interdependent system. And that matters because people are often drawn to the most dramatic image available: flames, raiders, crumbling walls, the sea peoples, a sudden attack, a final battle. But the old world was probably more vulnerable than those images suggest, even before the worst destruction arrived. That is the unsettling thing here. A palace can still function while its assumptions are dying. A port can still receive ships while the routes behind those ships are becoming unreliable. A kingdom can still issue orders while the grain, metal, and confidence needed to enforce those orders are thinning at the edges. So the collapse may have felt, at first, less like the end of civilization and more like a season of bad news that refused to end. One missing cargo, then another. A poor harvest, then another. More pressure on the same storehouses. More fear at the same coastlines. More strain on the same rulers who were expected to solve everything. That is how a tightly coupled trade network becomes dangerous. Not because one thing goes wrong, but because many things begin going wrong in ways that amplify one another. Which brings us back to Eric Klein's phrase and why it endures. A perfect storm of collapse is not satisfying in the way a single culprit is satisfying. It does not give you one face to blame. It gives you overlap. Drought feeding scarcity. Scarcity feeding instability. Instability feeding destruction. Destruction feeding more instability. And once that loop begins, every surviving center becomes more exposed than the last. The next step is to look at what happens after that threshold is crossed, when the old powers stop absorbing shocks and start passing them on. Once that threshold is crossed, collapse stops being local. This is the part people often miss when they picture it breaking apart. They imagine one city failing, then another, as if each disaster were self-contained. But in an interdependent system, the fall of one center becomes a new problem for every other center still trying to stand. A port no longer trading does not only hurt itself, it cuts a route. A kingdom no longer governing its territory does not only lose control at home, it releases pressure outward, onto neighbors, onto sea lanes, onto already strained stores of food and metal. That is how damage begins to travel. Think of a merchant ship that never arrives. Somewhere else, someone waits for copper. Somewhere else, tin is already late. Somewhere else again, a ruler counts on a delivery to pay workers, equip guards, or keep a harbor loyal. Now remove one reliable partner from that chain, then another. The effect is not dramatic all at once. At first, it is a hesitation, then rerouting, then shortage, then fear of further shortage, which changes behavior before the goods themselves even disappear. People hold back reserves. Officials make harder demands. Safer roads become crowded, and crowded roads become dangerous. In a world like this, every disruption teaches the next disruption how to hurt more. So, the destruction of the Hittite Empire, the breakup of Mycenaean Greece, and the ruin of Ugarit matter as system events, not just local tragedies. Each broken point weakens confidence in every remaining point. Each surviving power has to absorb refugees, threats, rumors, and missing cargo all at once. Egypt survives, yes, but even survival starts to look expensive. Holding together under those conditions means spending strength faster than it can be replaced. And if you pause on that for a moment, you can feel why the collapse gained momentum. A drought-struck kingdom can still endure if trade works. A damaged trade route can still be bypassed if strong states hold the region together. Border raiding can still be managed if reserves are deep and authority is trusted. But once those supports begin failing together, each remedy weakens the next one. Protect the convoy, and the countryside goes exposed. Guard the storehouses, and another frontier thins out. Send grain here, and another city waits in bitterness. This is where order begins to feed on its own weakness. And once that starts happening, even people who are not raiders, not rulers, not soldiers, just ordinary families tied to fields, ports, and workshops begin making choices that change the map as surely as armies do. And those ordinary choices matter more than they first appear. When a system is healthy, small decisions stay small. A family stores a little extra grain. A trader delays one journey. A workshop slows for a week. None of that changes history by itself. But in a world already under pressure, those same choices begin to accumulate. People become cautious. They hold back what they can. They trust local survival more than distant promises. A port may still be open. A storehouse may still be guarded. A ruler may still issue commands. And yet the real movement of the world is already changing underneath them. That is one of the coldest features of this collapse. It is not only made by kings and raiders. It is also made by hesitation. Think about what happens when enough people decide that the wider system no longer feels reliable. Fewer risks are taken. Fewer routes are trusted. Fewer goods move on faith alone. Every shipment is weighed against danger. Every obligation is measured against what might be needed at home. In a tightly coupled trade network, that kind of caution becomes its own force. It slows circulation. It hardens local boundaries. It makes distant dependencies feel less like opportunity and more like exposure. And once that shift begins, the old palace-centered world starts losing its grip, even where walls still stand. This is why the late Bronze Age collapse of 1177 BC should not be imagined only as destruction arriving from the outside. It is also a withdrawal from within, a thinning of confidence, a narrowing of horizons. The same connections that once made copper, tin, grain, and finished goods flow across long distances now begin to look dangerous to the people depending on them. The larger web becomes harder to maintain because the human beings inside it are no longer sure that maintaining it will keep them safe. That is how a broad crisis becomes self-reinforcing. Drought raises pressure. Fragile supply lines carry that pressure farther. The fall of major powers makes every remaining route less secure. Then ordinary caution deepens the slowdown even more. No single step looks dramatic in isolation. Together, they change the shape of the whole region. And once the old order starts shrinking like that, something else begins to happen at the edges of the wreckage. Not yet renewal, not yet recovery, but the first rough outline of a different world trying to form. What forms at the edges is something rougher than a new empire arriving fully shaped. A world learning to live after the old one stops coordinating it. When the great centers weaken, people do not stop eating, sailing, building, bargaining, or trying to stay alive. They keep doing all of those things, just with less certainty and less support from the structures that once organized everything. That is one of the most important things to understand about this collapse. The end of the old order is not the end of human life. It is the end of a certain scale of control. You can feel the difference if you picture the region after the main shocks have passed through it. Fewer secure routes, fewer guarantees, more local decisions, more caution, more improvisation. A harbor may still function, but not as part of the same wide, confident system as before. A workshop may still produce, but with different materials, different expectations, smaller horizons. What used to move through palaces and far-reaching trade webs now has to find narrower paths. And that change matters because it begins reshaping what power even looks like. In the old world, strength came from managing distance, controlling routes, receiving metal, storing grain, coordinating labor, keeping a large network dependable enough to support palaces and armies. But once that structure falters, smaller and more flexible forms start to make more sense. People who can adapt locally, move carefully, and work with less dependence on distant promises suddenly have an advantage the great powers did not train themselves to need. That is why the collapse can feel so paradoxical. It is devastation, yes. Cities are ruined. Kingdoms break apart. The Hittite Empire is gone. Mycenaean Greece fragments. Ugarit falls. Egypt survives, but diminished. And yet, inside that damage, the region is also being forced to experiment. New habits emerge because the old habits no longer function. New forms of exchange become possible because the previous system no longer dominates every route and every storehouse. This is adjustment under pressure. And that makes the next turn in the story especially striking, because from the wreckage of this broken age comes not only loss, but one of the most enduring tools in human history. Not a palace, not a dynasty, not a bronze fleet crossing the sea. Something smaller, portable, easier to carry than grain, easier to lose than a kingdom, and far harder to erase once it begins to spread. That tool is the Phoenician alphabet. It appears almost modest beside everything we have been talking about. Just a writing system, small enough to travel, practical enough to use, flexible enough to survive in a world that had become less centralized and less secure. And that is exactly why it matters. In the shattered landscape after the old powers weakened, something light had an advantage over something heavy. The Bronze Age world had depended on large structures, big courts, managed storehouses, long routes, stable authority, and specialists who kept the machinery of power turning. But after the Hittite Empire was destroyed, after Mycenaean Greece broke apart, after cities like Ugarit were ruined, the conditions that favored those heavy systems had changed. Egypt survived, but in reduced form. The wider network no longer held together in the same way. In that thinner world, a portable script fit the times better than a palace bureaucracy. That is the deeper irony inside the late Bronze Age collapse of 1177 BC. The same event that erased so much of the old order also opened space for forms that could move more easily through a fractured region. A simpler way to record names, goods, promises, and obligations could spread where older, more cumbersome systems struggled. You no longer needed the same kind of monumental center to keep writing alive. The written word could travel with merchants, with cargo, with local exchange. It could fit the new scale of the world. And that is why this collapse is not only a story of destruction. It is also a story of redistribution, of power, of knowledge, of what kinds of tools can thrive after a system built on distance and concentration begins to fail. The old age had been magnificent, but it had also been rigid. Once it broke, smaller and more adaptable things found room to grow. Not because the disaster was good, but because collapse clears space as brutally as it destroys. Which leaves us with the question that always follows the fall of a world. If something as enduring as the Phoenician alphabet could rise from these ruins, then what exactly was the old order preventing before it fell? What the old order was preventing, in part, was flexibility. Large palace systems are powerful when the world around them is stable enough to support their weight. They can store, command, record, and coordinate across great distances. But they also tend to pull control inward. Knowledge gathers at the center. Trade gathers at the center. Authority gathers at the center. If you want grain moved, metal counted, labor directed, or promises recorded, you go through the machinery. That is efficient until the machinery itself starts failing. Then the very features that once looked like strength begin to look like confinement. A palace world prefers scale. It prefers hierarchy. It prefers long chains of obligation held together by trust in the center. But after the Great Breakdown, after the Hittite Empire is destroyed, after Mycenaean Greece fragments, after Ugarit falls, after Egypt survives in reduced form, such order becomes harder to maintain. The distances are the same, but the confidence is not. The roads are still there, but the guarantees behind them have thinned out. Under those conditions, smaller, lighter, more adaptable tools and habits begin to matter more. So the rise of the Phoenician alphabet feels so revealing. It belongs to a changed world. A world where communication has to travel with merchants and local exchange, not only with palaces and official archives. A world where something simple enough to move, copy, and use across unstable conditions suddenly has a real advantage. In that sense, the collapse did not only destroy the old network, it changed which systems could survive after it. And that is the deeper historical sting here. The old age was not merely broken from the outside. It had become so complex, so dependent, so concentrated, that when stress hit from several directions, it left too little room to bend. The new forms that emerge afterward are not grander. At first, they are smaller, leaner, less certain, but they can live in a harsher environment. They do not ask as much of distance. They do not depend as completely on a single center holding everything together. So when we look back at this collapse, we are not only looking at an ending, we are looking at a transfer, away from heavy systems that required constant stability toward lighter ones that could keep moving through uncertainty. And once you see that, the final question starts to sharpen, because the real lesson of this catastrophe may not be about why one ancient world died, but about what kinds of worlds are most likely to survive when the pressure starts building again. That question brings the old disaster uncomfortably close to us, because once you strip away the bronze blades, the harbor smoke, and the ruined palace walls, the structure of the problem feels familiar. A world grows rich by linking distant places together. It becomes fast, efficient, and impressive. Copper moves from Cyprus. Tin comes from afar, from places like Afghanistan. Goods cross water. Authority depends on those movements. Then stress enters the system. Drought, fear, broken routes, failing centers, and suddenly the same connections that once created strength begin carrying weakness from one end of the network to the other. You do not need to force the comparison. It is already there. We know what it feels like when one missing component stops work far away from where the shortage began. We know what it means when transport delays ripple outward, when shelves thin, when prices rise, when trust in the system starts to wobble before the system has visibly collapsed. That is part of why this ancient story still hits so hard. The Late Bronze Age collapse of 1177 BC is not modern in its details, but it is deeply modern in its logic. Interdependence can make a civilization powerful and frighteningly exposed, and the people living inside such a world rarely feel that exposure clearly while the system is still delivering what it promised. That may be the most haunting part of all. The old palaces, the great trade cities, the major kingdoms, they likely felt durable right up to the point when durability started failing in public. A missed shipment here, a weaker harvest there. A little more caution, a little more pressure, a little less room to improvise. Then suddenly the map changes, and everyone realizes the strain was never small. It was cumulative. It was structural. It had been building in quiet places. Storehouses, fields, docks, ledgers, coastlines, long before it announced itself in fire. So when we ask what kinds of worlds survive pressure, we are really asking a sharper question. What kinds of worlds can keep functioning when the center no longer guarantees the future? That is where this story is heading now. Not toward one final culprit, because there isn't one. Towards something more useful, and in a way more unsettling. The difference between a system that is merely strong in good times and one that can still bend when the shocks begin to arrive together. That difference between looking strong and staying functional is where the real warning lives. A civilization can be magnificent in calm weather. It can move rare materials across sea and land. It can keep distant regions tied together through trust, storage, and routine. It can make the whole arrangement feel permanent. But if that stability depends on every major link continuing to work, if copper must arrive, tin must arrive, harvests must hold, ports must stay open, rulers must stay credible, then strength becomes conditional. It is real, but only while the background holds. And that is what failed here. The old world was not weak in any simple sense. It was advanced enough to create a wide network, organized enough to run it, and rich enough to benefit from it for generations. The Uluburun shipwreck proves that. The trade web around bronze proves that. The pollen cores, lake levels, and tree rings prove that the environment was turning harsher. The destruction of the Hittite Empire, the breakup of Mycenaean Greece, the ruin of Ugarit, and Egypt's diminished survival prove that the strain reached the highest level. The pattern is clear now. The system did not collapse because it lacked sophistication. It collapsed because its sophistication depended on too many moving parts staying aligned under pressure. That is a hard lesson, because we tend to admire systems for their efficiency. We admire how smoothly they run when supplies are steady and conditions are favorable. We admire scale, speed, reach. We admire the ability to specialize. One place providing metal, another grain, another shipping, another administration. But specialization narrows your room to improvise. Efficiency trims away slack. Interdependence rewards peace and punishes disruption. So when stress arrives from several directions at once, a civilization can discover, too late, that what made it brilliant also made it brittle. So the story refuses to become comforting. There is no neat villain to isolate, no single switch that got flipped, no one event you could remove and save the whole age with certainty. What you have instead is an interlocking structure that became less resilient than it appeared, then met a run of pressures it could not absorb. Once you understand that, the final stretch of this story changes. It stops asking only, what destroyed that world? It starts asking something closer and more difficult. What does resilience actually look like if raw power and wide connection are not enough? Resilience, in a story like this, does not look heroic. It looks plain. uneven, sometimes even disappointing. A resilient world is not the one with the tallest walls or the richest palace at the height of its success. It is the one that can keep feeding people when one route fails. The one that can still function when a shipment goes missing, when the weather turns against it, when one center weakens without dragging every other center down with it. That kind of strength is harder to admire because, in good years, it can look inefficient, redundant, slower than necessary. But redundancy is exactly what the old order kept trimming away. The Bronze Age system grew powerful by becoming specialized. Copper here, tin from far away, grain concentrated in major stores, authority concentrated in major courts, exchange concentrated in major ports. That arrangement produced wealth, reach, and coordination on a remarkable scale. It also meant that each part became more dependent on the proper function of the others. Once enough strain entered the system, the same elegance that made it impressive began reducing its options. There were fewer backups than the grandeur of the age might lead you to expect. That is why this collapse feels so modern in its structure, even when every detail is ancient. A system can be efficient enough to amaze itself and still be fragile in ways it does not want to see. While conditions are favorable, that fragility hides inside the smoothness of ordinary life. Ships arrive, metals combine, harvests move into storage, officials keep accounts. Rulers appear competent because the machine around them is still delivering. Then one pressure arrives, then another, and all at once, the system discovers that it is not built to improvise at scale. In this case, you can watch that discovery happen across the evidence. The Uluburun shipwreck shows the reach. The bronze supply chain shows the dependency. The pollen cores, lake levels, and tree rings show environmental stress. The fall of the Hittite Empire, the breakup of Mycenaean Greece, the destruction of Ugarit, and Egypt's diminished survival show the consequences. And Eric Klein's model gives those fragments a shape severe enough to hold them together. A pattern of insufficient flexibility meeting compounded stress. And that leaves one last turn before we can face the ending properly. Because once you understand what made this world vulnerable, you also have to ask what it felt like for the people inside it who never saw the full pattern, only the missing cargo, the drier fields, the quieter harbor, and the long silence where certainty used to be. That long silence is the most human part of the whole catastrophe. The silence, not the grand map, the palace ruins, or the later theories. The ship that does not come. The storehouse that opens later than usual. The dry taste in the air above a field that should be greener by now. A workshop waiting on material that used to arrive as part of the rhythm of the year. A harbor where people still show up at dawn, still scan the horizon, still listen for the familiar sounds of unloading, and hear only water against wood. That is how this kind of collapse enters ordinary life. Most people inside it would never have seen the full pattern. They would not have known about pollen cores or tree rings, or how a missing load of tin from far away could ripple into a shortage somewhere else. They would not have stood above the Eastern Mediterranean like a historian, tracing the fall of the Hittite Empire, the breakup of Mycenaean Greece, the destruction of Ugarit, and the reduced survival of Egypt as parts of one connected process. They would have felt it locally, as inconvenience first, then concern, then a new habit of caution that slowly hardened into the way life worked. That matters because systems do not only fail in the abstract, they fail in kitchens, on docks, in workshops, in lines of waiting people. They fail when trust turns from instinct into calculation, When every journey is weighed harder, when every promise sounds a little thinner than it did before. In a tightly coupled trade network, the great danger is not only that damage travels, it is that people begin adapting to damage before the system has officially admitted it is in trouble. And once enough people do that, the adaptation itself changes the outcome. So imagine the old world in its final decades from that angle, as a widening gap between what the system still claimed to be and what the people inside it were beginning to suspect. The rulers still ruled, the ports still opened. The ledgers were still marked. But underneath all that, confidence was draining away. And when confidence drains faster than the stores can refill, the end is usually closer than anyone wants to say out loud. Which is why, in the last stretch of this story, we have to return to the central idea one final time, not as a theory now, but as the only shape broad enough to hold all of this at once. That shape is Eric Klein's, and it matters because nothing narrower is wide enough. By the time you reach this point, the evidence is no longer scattered debris. It begins to lock together. The Uluburun shipwreck shows a world already bound across long distances. The bronze economy shows how much depended on copper from Cyprus and tin from far away, including places like Afghanistan. Pollen cores, lake levels, and tree rings point to prolonged drought around 1200 BC. The Hittite Empire falls. Mycenaean Greece breaks apart. Ugarit is destroyed. Egypt survives, but diminished. The Phoenician alphabet rises afterward in a thinner, more flexible world. These are not isolated curiosities. They are pieces of one pattern. And that pattern is not elegant in the way we usually want history to be elegant. It does not give us a villain we can point at and say, there, that was the cause. It gives us overlap, pressure arriving from more than one direction. A civilization built on coordination, specialization, and distance, meeting a run of shocks that keep arriving before the previous one has finished doing damage. Drought shrinks the margin. Dependency magnifies delay. Political centers weaken. Trade routes become unreliable. Fear changes behavior. Destruction spreads. Survivors narrow their horizons. The network begins teaching its own damage where to go next. That is why the phrase perfect storm of collapse fits so well. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is structurally honest. A storm like that is not one wave. It is several systems meeting over the same water. And once they overlap, even strong ships can go down. The old world of the Eastern Mediterranean was something like that. Rich, organized, outward-looking, deeply connected. For generations, those qualities made it formidable. Then, the same qualities made it vulnerable to cascading stress. The very links that once created resilience across space became channels through which failure could spread. There is something terrible about that recognition, because it means the world did not need to be foolish to collapse. It only needed to be optimized for the wrong kind of future. And now we are almost at the last step, because once you accept that this was not one disaster, but a convergence, the ending changes too. It is no longer just about what was lost. It becomes about what survived the loss, what adapted, and why the people living afterward inherited a world smaller than the one before it, and strangely, more open in certain ways. That wider shape lets us return, one last time before the end, to the people who never saw the whole map. They did not know they were living inside a model. They did not know about the Uluburun shipwreck resting somewhere beneath the sea, preserving proof of a world stitched together by exchange. They did not know that later readers would connect copper from Cyprus, tin from far-off places like Afghanistan, drying landscapes, broken states, and the afterlife of the Phoenician alphabet into one long argument. What they knew was smaller than that, and more painful. They knew what it felt like when a familiar system stopped answering in familiar ways. A harbor that should have been busy feels muted. A storehouse opens, but not enough. A journey that used to be routine now carries risk. A ruler's promise lands with less force than it once did. The field gives less. The road feels longer. The silence between one expected event and the next begins to fill with private calculation. How much to keep back? Whether to trust the route? Whether to leave? Whether the center can still protect anything beyond its own walls? This is how large collapses become intimate. Not through speeches, but through adjustment. And those adjustments matter because people do not wait for historians to name a crisis before they start surviving it. They move first. They hide first. They reroute first. They lower expectations first. In a tightly coupled trade network, those scattered acts of self-protection do more than reflect instability. They deepen it. The system keeps looking whole from a distance, while up close, thousands of people are already behaving as if the guarantees are gone. That may be the most haunting thing about the entire Late Bronze Age collapse of 1177 BC. The official world and the lived world can drift apart for a while. Palaces still function. Ports still open. Records are still kept. But underneath, confidence has already slipped. And once enough ordinary people stop betting their safety on the old arrangement, no ruler, no archive, no ceremony can fully restore what has been lost. So when the destruction finally becomes visible, when the Hittite Empire is gone, when Mycenaean Greece fragments, when Ugarit falls, when Egypt survives only in narrowed form, it is not the beginning of the crisis. It is the moment the deeper crisis becomes impossible to hide. And that brings us to the final turn. Because if a world can die slowly in private before it dies publicly in history, then the real ending is not just about what collapsed, but about what the collapse made possible afterward. So the ending is a coastline after the noise has passed. The old network breaks. The Hittite Empire is gone. Mycenaean Greece is no longer the same world it had been. Ugarit falls silent. Egypt remains, but with less reach, less certainty, less power to hold the wider system together. The routes that once carried copper from Cyprus, tin from far-off places like Afghanistan, grain, finished goods, and political trust no longer bind the Eastern Mediterranean in the same way. What Eric Klein calls a perfect storm of collapse does not leave one neat crater behind. It leaves a changed landscape, smaller centers, thinner connections, reduced horizons, and people learning to live without the guarantees that had once seemed built into the world itself. And yet, the world after it is not empty. Ships still move. Fields are still worked. Hands still count what is owed. Somewhere in the aftermath, a trader scratches simple signs into a surface to mark goods, debt, ownership, memory. Lighter than the heavy writing of a palace trying to speak for an empire. More portable, better suited to a fractured age. That is where the Phoenician alphabet enters the story. Not as a miracle descending on ruins, but as a tool fit for a harsher world. One of the strangest truths in this whole catastrophe is that when the great centers lost their grip, smaller forms gained room to travel. That is the image I keep coming back to. The burning city was real, and the broken wall was real too. A hand making a mark, because the large machine is gone, and life still has to continue. For all its grandeur, the old age depended on everything arriving when it should. The later one, poorer and less certain, learned to move with less. Sometimes what survives history is not the tallest thing that stood, but the smallest thing a shaken world can still carry. By evening, the harbor is quieter than it used to be. The smoke has thinned. Water taps the posts in the dark, patient as ever, as if the sea never cared who ruled the shore. If you stayed all the way through, leave a like, or pass this on to someone who still loves the long, difficult stories hidden under the dust of the ancient world.